Pretty amazing week, especially when you consider that in history you're going to look back on this week in tabular form with no change listed on the S&P 500. But in fact, we had VIX 65 to start off the week. Just really an extraordinary shift in sentiment, but one also that really leaves us kind of on an even keel going into next week. Definitely a victory by the bulls to tourniquet the bleeding, to turn things around, and to break even on the week. But obviously, carnage behind us usually does not stay isolated when you get events like the one we saw, massive blow-up in volatility, usually the sign of a regime shift, one that I think is still rooted in economics, not just a singular trade blowing up, more related to the economy, more related also to the fact the economy has a little trouble maybe supporting very high valuations and some AI stuff that hasn't quite delivered. So next week, though, we shift mostly to a macro focus. Looking at the way the winners this week came back, I think gives you some good perspective on how to navigate over the coming weeks. Really, the big date on the calendar is the week of the 25th to the 28th. That's Jackson Hole and NVIDIA earnings. But look, over the last 5 days, this does take us back to Friday, so it just kind of includes that net move around the jobs and then through this week. Value shares underperforming on a factor standpoint, small caps underperforming, the Mag 7 doing better than those two, but really the stock-specific momentum funds that are tied into the companies that did the best over the last 6 months, that's where we saw the buying of the dip. Right now, it really is very much an equity-specific story. In fact, looking at the outlook for an inflation-driven week next week, you could be getting some volatility in bonds that might even make the bond trade a little questionable. I'm not changing anything on my risk radar for bonds or the dollar, but it is important to note that they did spring back as well. In fact, the dollar actually held on this week a decent amount. The 10-year yield also actually did kind of give us a little bit of life with the bounce in both of them here. In fact, the dollar kind of held the previous lows from the spring if you stretch the chart a little bit. The point is that next week, if inflation doesn't go perfectly, you might have volatility in bonds that makes some of the equity market a little bit unstable. Now, I don't think that's our primary issue. Generally, you want to see good data, you want to see strength, you want to see some activity. Possibility that even a hot inflation print, if it shows that there still is consumer spending, if it's paired with good retail sales, if it's paired with good Walmart earnings, that's the type of thing that might be welcome at this point when we're so worried about what the last employment print meant. But when it comes to stocks, what's really important here is that the places to hide are those with momentum. That's really important. That's your winning cohort. Some of the Mag 7 also offering a little bit of safety, but given some of the valuations, still in Apple, still in Microsoft, the very consumer-centric stuff whose products I'm not sure are going to be that well received, those may not be working quite as well. What we saw this week is that the GLP trade worked, healthcare winners worked, some of the momentum stuff in cloud actually worked, like Palantir that came back. So it is stock specific. There are ways through the storm, but it's going to be, I think, equity specific on the most stable trades there that don't have valuation problems, and that's a pretty short list. I think the dollar probably showed its worth by holding on to its general range lows. The dollar probably a place to hang out. Volatility seems like generally a place to hang out. We saw still Bitcoin come under pressure. That chart doesn't look good. It's still trending lower. Lower lows and lower highs. It's going to take a lot for me to flip the light green on Bitcoin, but maybe next week bonds and the dollar might shift if inflation throws us off. Have a great weekend. Congrats on breaking even.